Well, here we are. It's Capstone time. This has been such a learning experience for me, and I hope it can be the same for you guys. For my capstone, I chose male leadership, specifically focusing on the spiritual tie-in to it all. Of course, with that, I have to give a short disclaimer before my speech. I in no way think women can't or shouldn't lead. I think if you feel called to it, you absolutely should. But for my capstone, I want to focus on why/how God calls men to lead. Genesis 1:26 is God saying, "Let us make mankind in our image and our likeness so they may rule." When I first read that left me with so many questions. What does it mean to rule? How to rule? Why should we rule? To help you guys better understand my confusion and also to just kind of give some general past, I had an interesting childhood. My mom had always told me that men should be leaders. It's important for men to be leaders. But of course I didn't listen because I didn't want to eat my vegetables. Why would I want to be a leader? But they all painfully came into focus around 2019. My parents got divorced and I was left very sad for a while. There was a hole where a father figure should be, and I ended up filling it with some mentors. Huge shout out to Zack Snyder and Sam Butler. They were so influential on me, but they ended up leaving or going on to other avenues, and so I was still left with that hole. This left me to take an acute interest in personal growth, to the point of where I was watching Andrew Tate videos, no matter how healthy that is, and just generally wanting to grow more. So when it time to choose capstone, I decided to choose leadership. Of course, everyone does leadership, or most people do in some aspect, at least last year. So I wanted to narrow mine in with my specific background in mind. So I chose to do male leadership with spiritual tie into it all. If there are any juniors watching this later, I would like to tell them, or even Johnny behind the camera, it's so important that when you choose your capstone, not to just choose what you love, because that's what they really hark on, but also to choose something you want to grow in, and grow you will. Another part of that was Spectre is my advisor. Every single class I had with him was a master class, and it was a wonderful time. Initially, I didn't think myself a leader in any aspect of the word. I always wanted to be a leader. I didn't like conformity in any aspect, but I didn't feel like one. However, when I was talking with Spectre about collective versus individual leadership, something clicked for me, and we'll talk about that later. This whole story really starts at the very beginning of senior year, and that was when we did senior retreats. For senior retreats, you go up to the mountains, you do some hiking, sit by the campfire, but the magnum opus, or the piece de resistance, is 8 hours in the forest. And with that, you sit with a Bible, you sit with prompts, and you get a little word of encouragement. Now, for one reason or the other, I decided to wait a while for that word of encouragement in case I needed it. But eventually I didn't feel that I was needing it, and I was just enjoying my time, so I decided to read it. I was surprised to find that mine was from Weir. I appreciate him as a man, and I really loved talking to him, but I had no idea he was going to write mine. And he commented on how he noticed my abilities on leadership and how I should develop them. I was so confused when I read this because, like I said, I didn't feel like any sort of leader in any aspect of the word. But again, this all comes down to that individual versus collective type of leadership. Once I discovered that, I was off to the races. I discovered I didn't need any virtue. There wasn't any sort of charisma I had to build. I could just do it. I could become a leader. So with that in mind, I actually want to talk about what we talked about. And this is individual versus collective leadership. Individual leadership is more the command army type of structure. This is where you have a leader at the top who tells someone below him what to do, who tells someone below him what to do, who tells someone below him what to do. Now, this is a fairly effective mode of leadership, and it's really good for crisis type situations because it allows for quick acting, but it doesn't build a community at all. And so this should only be used maybe 1% of the time. 99% of the time, you should be aiming for this collective type of model. Because what that does is it helps foster community. It helps help people. And that's what leadership really is at the base of it. It's helping people. And so doing this, it feels less forceful, and in general, it's just a better mode of leadership which should be used everywhere, except, of course, those crisis type situations. Knowing this, I wanted to cement it further in me, and as well as just kind of stress myself, so I decided to teach a class of 7th graders. Now, as you can probably tell by now, I'm not the absolute worst public speaker, but I do have crippling social anxiety, so teaching a class of 7th graders was not something that came naturally to me, but again, I wanted to grow myself. We started off talking about, again, individual versus collective leadership, because that's what I really wanted to cement. But we ended up kind of talking and moving over to how leadership is not the position. It's something that comes either before or after. And I think that's a really important thing to note because in modern times, it's so common for our society to aspire to a high position. But when you get there, realize, or not realize, even worse, that you don't actually have that leadership. So, yeah, that's what we talked about. I thought it was really interesting. They were also reading about Joseph at the time, so we thought it would tie in really well to that. So that was something that was rather encouraging to me during it all. It was interesting though, because I noticed this dynamic throughout the whole class. There was definitely, I had been given all the power, I had been given, all eyes were on me, but there was definitely more of a trust towards Miss Funk, and that's not anything bad. I think that's just natural and proves my point that leadership is not something that can be given, it's something that's earned over time. After this, we talked about another really interesting thing that I learned from Spector's masterclass, and that is value-based leadership. The way he introduced it to me was with this thing called the Harvard Values Test. And on it, there are 30 or so values, such as like honor, self-respect, that kind of thing. And so you go through and you label them 1 through 3, 1 through 5, however you want to do it. And then you have to narrow it down to your top 5, and then from there to your top 3. It was interesting in the class to see how these 7th graders, like, they were so confused during it all. And it's natural because you have to choose between your own values, which is very hard because you all have things that you value, and trying to narrow that down to your top 3 is very hard. And then when I further suggested that you then have to do that with other people's values, I think they had the same reaction I did of, wow, this is incredibly hard, but incredibly important. Another way I like to explain this is through something that I've dubbed the water park example. Let's say you're a really fun person who likes to hang out, you like to make new memories, you like to just go out and live. And so you want to go to a water park for the fun of it. But you have a friend who's a little bit more strict, he just wants to get into his college, he's focused on that. For that, if you just told them that it's a fun time, you're gonna have a great time, you should go out and do it, they're not gonna be as convinced. And furthermore, it'll feel a little forceful. But if you were to convince them by saying, for example, you should do this because it'll give you a break from working, it'll allow you to write better essays, and it'll make you a more rounded person, which colleges like to see. This not only is more convincing to them, it feels more natural to them, and it's collective leadership, it's better. I was really surprised about the second aspect of value-based leadership though, which is that you can change your own values. Of course, you can find your own values through the Harvard Value Test, but you can also find your own values. When finding other people's values, you have to listen, you have to decipher what it means. For example, if someone gets good grades, it can mean 1, that they care about their grades, it can mean 2, that they value their parents' time and money. So you have to decipher that with your own values. It's not as awkward as handing someone else to be like, hey, can you take this so I can find your values? You can just find your own values through that test. But furthermore, you can change your values. So to do that, I read a book called Manvotionals, The Art of Manliness and Manvotionals, which of course is an incredibly cheesy name, but also an incredibly good book. And it splits manliness into 7 main virtues. Manliness, which is kind of more of an introduction to it all. Courage, industry, or use of your time. Resolution, or willpower. Self-reliance, and then discipline and honor. Now for each of these, it has a short introduction to the virtue, / why it's important. And after that, it goes into first and secondhand sources from leaders like Marcus Aurelius or Alexander the Great. And so when you hear these virtues, it's not so much a debate in your head of, is this what I want? Is this the right thing? Because you have examples from these great leaders. And it's also written by a really cool Christian family of husband and wife, so you know that it also has that Christian implication of it all. This was an extremely helpful book to help define my virtues, but also it showed me that it's interesting to see how all of the best leaders we think of are in our past. Don't get me wrong, there's probably presidents or some things that you admire nowadays, but all of the greatest leaders are in the past. If we think of Alexander the Great or Marcus Aurelius, like we mentioned before, but also like Churchill is the most recent one I can think of. And this really brought attention that there's a general decline over time, and this just furthered my idea that we need more leaderships nowadays. It also showed me that manliness is leadership. Inherently, when you try to be more of a good man, you'll just become a better leader. That's just how those virtues are intertwined. And that's what I want to bring back to the idea that women can't or shouldn't be leaders. I in no way think that. If you feel called to it, there are so many great women leaders out there. There's so many amazing preachers and so many influential people. But I wanted to focus specifically on how there was a loss of male leadership, like I was saying, over time. And I think this is one of the reasons why we don't aspire to manliness as much as we should. Leadership is a lifestyle. This is something that sounds easy to say, but it's incredibly difficult in practice. There were so many times where I'd say something ridiculous to my sister, and my mom would go, "Well, aren't you learning leadership? You should be more leader-like." And I had to accept that she is right and that that is something that is true, because it's not an activity. And by that, I don't mean it's hard. Leadership is one of the hardest things you can do, but it's something that happens all the time. You don't go out, lead, and sit on a couch. You live it like life. You can be a good life, a bad life, a life of leadership. It's a whole lifestyle. Now that I felt fairly confident about what leadership should be, I wanted to learn more about more of the common values. And so I learned about what I'm going to dub the 4 theories. For this, Spectre gave me 2 articles, one which just describes the theories, and then the other ones which shows some potential weaknesses with the theories. So, and also what a Christian mindset should be. So we'll talk about that after. The first theory is the great man theory. This has people like Lincoln, Washington, Gandhi, or Hitler, unfortunately, but we'll talk about that later. This is focusing on the person with extraordinary influence. So when you look for a leader, you look at someone who is very influential. It's not a value-free ideology, but it claims to be, because of course influence is in its own self a value, and also there are so many other virtues that come alongside that. Situational is similar to the great man theory. It has all the same people, and that's kind of due to how they classify it. They don't really focus on who was great leaders, but why they're great leaders. This one would claim, though, that they emerge largely due to happenstance. So the claim that a situational would make is if Abraham Lincoln was born 5 years later, he wouldn't be the same man he was. Contingency is kind of a combination of the both. It combines the great man theory and the situational theory, and it says there's the right man for every job. So if Washington was placed in the same situation but slightly different, it wouldn't have been the same, because it's right for every single, it just lined up perfectly. And again, they say it's value-free, but the mark of success is still influence, so it's kind of hard to say. Transactional is a little different from the rest. It basically focuses on influence, but more specifically on the gaining and maintaining of influence. This can be a little bit difficult to understand, though, because your goal and your tool for that goal are the same, influence. Your goal is to gain influence through influence, so it gets a little muddled in the definition. With that gone, I want to talk about what are some potential flaws with these 4 theories. That way you guys can hopefully, if you see them in your life, or if you see someone troubled about them, you can explain this to them. When you try to define leadership without values, it's still inherently there, and you kind of skirt past explaining why it's important to have those values. A great quote from that reading I did was, "If we leave the value implications of our teaching unaddressed, we encourage people, perhaps unwittingly, to aspire to great influence or high office, regardless of what they do there." In other words, it fosters self-delusion and irresponsibility. So let's get Hitler out of here, because obviously he wasn't a great leader. He did not improve his people in any way. He simply managed them. And that kind of brings it back to the position versus actual leadership. It's appalling to see how organized he was. He was a great manager. But leadership isn't so much measured with effectiveness. That's what the business definition would say. But it's measured by how much you can help your people. Collective leadership should bring attention to the work being done and the work that needs to occur or is occurring. A furthermore way that we can, so that's kind of what's wrong with it. Let's talk about what we can do and what we should do. You should refrain from power, for one. When you refrain from taking power in situations that you could and easily could, it gives you a lot of credibility. And it's much more natural credibility than trying to boast in any sort of way. Also, next up here. Yeah, leadership is where you find identity. And as Christians, that identity should be in Christ. 1 Corinthians 3:7 says, "So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow." So in other words, because God is our focus, he should be the one we should be serving to glorify, not ourselves. It's also important that we don't adapt a lone wolf ideology, because this is a very selfish way of thinking. I don't know where it is, but basically it's probably here. Yeah, there it is. Proverbs 18:1 says, "A man who isolates himself seeks his own desires. He rages against all wise judgment." So while you might be thinking that you're helping someone or saving yourself by taking yourself out of the equation, what you're actually doing is thinking that you can do it on your own. And God did not design us like that. He designed us for counsel from others. So why is there lack of male leadership? I was still confused about this, and so to do that, I kind of wanted to go back and see. So I talked to some 6th graders, over lunch because I wanted to see where it was in the development over time. During that time, it was really interesting. It wasn't bad in any way, but it wasn't at all what I expected. Without my own negligence or genuine belief, I had expected them to have more questions, and they just didn't. This kind of showed me that it also is somewhat of a lack of push from the previous generation. Not to say that we can't, but that there's just a general lack of it of outside influence. Or rather for the last experience, I decided to have a dialogue that turned into more of a conversation with some leaders in our school. It ended up being Weir, Wall, and Spector. This was a great conversation I had, and it kind of helped affirm my values, what I've learned so far. And it goes a little something like this. Leadership is a mentality, not a position. We kind of talked about that already. Anyone can be a leader starting right now. That was that realization that I had, that anyone can be a leader. There's no virtue. As long as you form that collective type of leadership, which you should, you'll be a great leader. Men should be leaders. It's a part of masculinity. That's what I learned from the book. Masculinity is just such a thing that's dwindling right now, and if it were more focused on, leadership would be a lot higher. Also, this is something that came up in the conversation and also just is something that I've learned, is that men need to reflect more. One of the main reasons I even started this whole journey was because I realized that there was an issue and that's something I wanted to improve. So, why is there a lack of male leadership? The unfortunate truth is it doesn't really matter. That's not to say that men are innocent in any way. It's our direct responsibility. We are men. But it's so hard to pin it on one thing. You could say it's men's fault because they're not good leaders. You could say it's women's fault because it's not a common attraction. There's so many ways that you could try to spin it, and the real truth is that it's not there. And so the best thing we can do is just try to improve it in any aspect of our life that we see. Women, please counsel the men into those lives, whether that be your sons, your husbands, even your fathers. Counsel them, because the guys give it a unique perspective that we really need. Furthermore, becoming a good leader is hard because it requires to be a good man before that. So again, counselship is really helpful. And I mean, God created heaven and earth. He created Adam and Eve. We were meant to work together to be able to do this. Behind every great man, there's a great woman. That's not just a saying. Men, don't forget it. And women, know that you guys are this, once you marry someone, you guys are almost a unit. Anything you do reflects badly on that person, and anything you do positively reflects good on both of you. Thank you all for coming. This has been a massive learning experience for me, and I hope it can be the same for you.